We live in a strange time. Extraordinary events keep happening that undermine the stability of our world. Suicide bombings, waves of refugees, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, the mainstream media, social justice, critical race theory, even. Yet those in control seem unable to deal with it. No one has any vision of a different, or a better kind of future. This is a story about how over the past 40 years, politicians, finances and technological utopians, rather than face up to the real complexities of the world, retreated. Instead, they constructed a simpler version of the world, in order to hang on to power. And as this fake world grew, all of us went along with it, because the simplicity was reassuring. Even those who thought they were attacking the system, the radicals, the artists, the musicians, and our whole counterculture, actually became part of the trickery. Because they too had retreated into the make-believe world, which is why their opposition has no effect, and nothing ever changes. But this retreat into a dream world allowed dark and destructive forces to fester and grow outside. Forces that are now returning to pierce the fragile surface of our carefully constructed fake world. Another utopian vision of cyberspace re-emerged after the financial crash of 2008. While the working class got no help from the government, the banks got a massive, multi-trillion-dollar bailout. For example, Citibank received $4.6 trillion as part of the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, otherwise known as the bailout. To put that into perspective, the Marshall Plan, the Louisiana Purchase, the space race, the bailouts for the savings and loans associations in the 1980s and 1990s, the Korean War, the New Deal, the invasion of Iraq, the Vietnam War, and NASA's entire budget over its lifetime, cost $3.92 trillion after inflation, less than the cost of the bailout for Citibank. This isn't counting the other banks that were bailed out, which when added up now controlled over 60% of US assets. And after all this spending with no help for US citizens, the rationale they gave was if the banks failed, it might destabilize the entire system. This is what spawned the Occupy protests. Public anger finally boiled over, and then the Occupy movement took over Wall Street, and then the Senate in Washington.
Have pretty much corrupted our political system. This is like the heart of it. I mean, this is a Senate building. These people have been put up, and they basically corrupted our democracy, and it's literally killing people. I'm an Iraqi war vet. I went to Iraq in 2009 to see what happens firsthand when we let corruption rule our government and our democracy, and we're coming here today basically just to raise awareness.
What drove the Occupy movement was the original dream of the internet that people like John Perry Barlow had outlined in the early 1990s. In his declaration of the independence of cyberspace, Barlow had described a new world free of politics and the old hierarchies of power, the space where people connected together as equals in a network and built a new society without leaders. Now the Occupy movement set out to build that kind of society in the real world. Even the meetings used the idea of the human microphone. People throughout the crowd repeated a speaker's words so everyone could hear them. But if someone wanted to challenge the speaker, the human amplifiers also had to repeat their words. So their voice had equal power. At least that was the idea. Each person was an autonomous individual who expressed what they believed, but together they became components in a network that organized itself through the feedback of information around the system. This was thought to be a model of how you could organize people without the exercise of power. However, it turned out to be the emergence of something far more chaotic. The next emergence of this phenomenon was the Arab Spring. The first revolution started on the internet. It quickly spread to Egypt on January 25, 2011, when thousands of Egyptians came out in groups across Cairo. Soon they started moving towards Tahrir Square, in what seemed like a spontaneous approach. And it was the internet which played a key role in organizing the group. One of the main activists was an Egyptian computer engineer. He worked for Google in Egypt, but had also set up the Facebook site that played the key role in organizing the first site that...
يعني ايه؟ شوية شباب أنا كنت بسميهم على الصفحة زمان عيال الفيسبوك. هم كانوا بيسمونا زمان أيام وقفات خالد سعيد في أول ما طلعنا خالص شوية العيال اللي على الفيسبوك اللي بيعملوا شوية دوشة. مش مصدقين إن الشباب دول نزلوا بعشرات الآلاف يوم ال 25. وأرجوكم يا جماعة مفيش أبطال، الأبطال هم الناس اللي في الشارع، الأبطال هو كل واحد فينا، مفيش النهاردة واحد راكب الحصان هو اللي بيضرب السرج ويحرك الناس، اوعى حد يضحك عليكم ويقول لكم كده. دي ثورة شباب الإنترنت، دي ثورة شباب الإنترنت اللي بقت بعد كده ثورة شباب مصر، اللي بعد كده بقت ثورة كل مصر.
But Godin was also overwhelmed by the power of this new technology. Overwhelmed by the fact that a computer engineer with a keyboard could call out thousands of people, some of whom have died during the protests.
أنا عايز أقول لكل أم وكل أب بجد فقط إنه مسكيني والله العظيم غلطت غلطت كل واحد كذا بالجسم وتوقف فيها.
Many liberals in the West saw this as proof of the revolutionary power of the internet. Again, it seemed to be able to organize a revolution without leaders. And this new phenomenon was powerful enough to topple a brutal dictator who had been backed by America and the West for 30 years. The internet radicals were not the only ones who saw their dreams being fulfilled in the Arab Spring. Many of the political leaders of the West also enthusiastically supported the revolutions because it seemed to fit with their simple idea of regime change. It might have failed in Iraq, but now people were rising up to rid themselves of the evil tyrants the politicians had both created and supported. So when an uprising began in Libya, Britain, France, and America supported it. And suddenly Colonel Gaddafi stopped being the hero of the West, with all the politicians and the public relations people and the academics who had all been curating his image suddenly disappeared. Gaddafi had once again become an evil dictator who had to be overthrown. Gaddafi retreated to the ruins of the house that the Americans had bombed 30 years before and addressed the world. In November 2011, a large convoy was spotted driving at high speed away from Colonel Gaddafi's home, with an American drone controlled from a shed outside Las Vegas following. The operator fired a missile at the lead car of the convoy. Gaddafi then fled looking for shelter from the oncoming rebel onslaught. He hid under the road in a drainage pipe before being dragged out at the mercy of angry rebels. Instead of becoming the democracy many had suspected would happen at Gaddafi's demise, Libya began to descend into chaos. It was around this time that other revolutions began to fail. The Occupy camps had become trapped in an endless meeting. and it became clear that there was a terrible confusion at the heart of the movement. The radicals had believed that they could create a new way of organizing people, while shaping a new society. But what they did not have was a picture of what that society would be like, or how it functioned. And the politicians, corporations, and special interests that were the focus of the movement had subverted their efforts with another campaign of perception management. However, their weakness was that the revolution was not about an idea. It was about how you manage things. And those who had started the revolution in Egypt came face to face with the same terrible fact. Social media had helped to bring people together in Tahrir Square, but once there, the internet gave no clue as to what kind of new society they could create in Egypt, and the movement stalled. A group that did have a path, however, was the Muslim Brotherhood, who rushed in to fill the vacuum. The Brotherhood took power in an election, which led to the liberals and the left, bit by bit, turning back to the military, asking them to save the revolution from being captured by religious extremists. In the spring of 2013, the military took action. They arrested the president and killed hundreds of his supporters who protested, and an extraordinary spectacle that unfolded in Tahrir Square. Thousands of liberals, who had begun the revolution 2 years ago, summoned by social media, now welcomed the military back by waving laser pointers at the helicopters flying overhead. After the failure of the revolutions, it was not just the radicals. No one in the West had any idea of how to change the law at home. The very politicians who had given so much of that power away to finance, Silicon Valley, and the ever-growing managerial bureaucracy, in effect, had become managers themselves. All their ventures had failed, and that simplistic vision of the world had been exposed as dangerous and destructive. What had subverted the West, however, was far more insidious than the blatant power grab made by the Muslim Brotherhood. Around 2011, when the Occupy movement began, media corporations, newspapers, and newly emerging blogs had started posting articles which contained words such as white privilege, systemic racism, or diversity training. And according to a statistical database known as the LexisNexis, these words had a sharp increase in their use around the same time. What was once a populist movement focused on the banks and politicians, Occupy Wall Street fell into a divisive cacophony of intersectional nonsense, which dissolved the already fragile unity of the protests. Some even speculate this was intentional. What was happening was the emergence of a new layer to the fake reality we currently reside in. It was a world that rose from the thrashing collapse of legacy news media. Advertising via Google became the largest platform to obtain money for online media companies, and with more and more people tuning out of legacy television, the internet was becoming the main source of viewership. This led to blogs, news organizations, and social media using those rational agents as market research. Keywords were used to find what articles and stories gained the most hits. And what got the most hits was anger. For example, police shooting videos became popular because of the emotional reaction, which began to manipulate the narrative surrounding police and minority communities. The more rage you induced within the system, the more money you got. It was simple, yet powerful. But the rational agents being used were still just a cartoon version of reality. And this cartoon version began to overtake the real world. People became convinced that what they saw on social media was real. The inexorable phenomenon of hypernormalization was now more powerful than any government, corporation, or religion. It was then that a group of men had realized this could work to their advantage. What they had done was turn politics into a strange theater where nobody knew what was true or what was fake any longer. They were called political technologists, and they were the key figures behind President Putin. They had kept him in a power unchallenged for 50 years. Some of them have been dissidents back in the 1970s that had been powerfully influenced by the science fiction writings of the Stokowski brothers. After the end of communism, they rose up and took control of the media. And they used it to manipulate the electorate on a vast scale. For them, reality was something that could be manipulated and shaped into anything you wanted it to be, taking their inspiration from the Hegelian school of thought. But then a technologist emerged who went much further, and his idea is what became central to Putin's grip on power. He was called Vladislav Surkov. Surkov originally came from the theater world, and those who have studied his career said that what he did was take avant-garde ideas from the theater and bring them into the heart of politics. Surkov's aim was not just to manipulate people, but to go deeper and play with and undermine their very perception, so they are never sure what is really happening. Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theater. He used Kremlin money to sponsor all kinds of groups, from mass anti-fascist youth organizations to the very opposite, neo-Nazi skinheads, and even liberal human rights groups who then attacked the government. Surkov even backed whole political parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Surkov let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or what was fake in modern Russia. A ceaseless shape-shifting narrative that is unstoppable because it is indefinable and constantly changing. As one journalist put it, it's a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused. Meanwhile, the real narrative was hidden away behind the stage. With an increasing dependence on social media for news, communication, and political discussions, the same phenomenon seemed to start happening in the West. It was becoming ever more clear that the current system operating civilization had deep flaws and structural weaknesses. Every month, there were new revelations of all the major banks' involvement in global corruption, of massive tax avoidance by all the major corporations, of the secret surveillance of everyone's emails by the National Security Agency. Even though all of this became public, no one was prosecuted except for a few people at the lowest levels. And behind it all, the massive inequality and institutional corruption kept on growing. The structure of power remained the same. Nothing ever changed because nothing could be allowed to destabilize the system. It was at this point the media began to adopt Surkov's methods of political theater. The malleable, undefinable nature of this new paradigm began to take form in the real world with the presidential campaign of Donald Trump. Once loved by everyone in Hollywood, Trump had turned into a villain overnight. All because he was running on the Republican ticket. The radicals, the artists, the celebrities, and whole liberal establishment were the first to fall in line with the new narrative. The nuance had been ejected from their worldview, becoming a simple black and white version of reality. The lies, the unaccountability, the political subversion, and the slow degradation of American culture had grown out of control. The rational agents were shaping reality for them, being tweaked by corporations who had no anchor to the real world. Silicon Valley, once a focal point in technological innovation, had abandoned their ideals of progress and freedom for a more safe, corporate worldview influenced by algorithmic woke ideologies. And this was something Donald Trump seemed to understand better than most politicians. His influence and work in the media hypersphere gave him valuable insight into how the system worked. News reports were not fixed about what he said, who he attacked or how he attacked them, and the narrative surrounding him was constantly changing. He attacked his Republican rivals as being all part of a broken and corrupt system of politics where everyone could be booked, using words that could have come from the Occupy movement. But at the same time, Trump was accused of using the same rhetoric as the extreme right in America. The media, both mainstream and online, was connecting with people's darkest fears, pushing them and bringing those fears out into the world. Many assertions about Trump were completely distorted or exaggerated. But Trump didn't care. He and his audience knew that much of what he said would be ignored, lied about, or misrepresented. But Trump had defeated the journalists. Because, while the journalists initially believed that their job was to expose lies and assert the truth, they had been blinded by the distorted lens that was the internet. And Trump understood what was happening. He knew how to control the media's response and what they focused on, tweeting things that at times made no sense. He had been a master at media manipulation for decades. And now, instead of using it to shape his image, he was using it to expose their own hypocrisy. More liberals began to tune out and shifted away from the left. The center began to grow, with 13% of voters who had voted for Obama casting a vote for Trump. As both sides of the political spectrum shifted, the rational voters had begun to move to the center, leaving the extremists behind who took control of their respective party. The fake world that had been under construction for the past 30 years was almost complete. Facts had become fluid and interchangeable. Science became political, and nuance had disappeared entirely. The liberals were outraged by Trump, but they expressed their anger in cyberspace. So it had no effect because the algorithms made sure that they only spoke to people who already agreed with them. Instead, ironically, their waves of angry messages and tweets benefited the large corporations who ran the social media platforms and advertising firms. It meant that the radical fury that came like waves across the internet no longer have the power to change the world. Instead, it was becoming a new conduit that was feeding the new systems of power and making them ever more powerful. The version of reality politics presented was no longer believable, that the stories politicians and the mainstream media apparatus told the people about the world stopped making sense. By now, Syria was being torn apart by a horrific civil war. The Arab Spring had turned into a vicious battle to the death between Bashar Assad and his opponents. And at the heart of the conflict was the force that his father had first brought to the West, the suicide bomb. Back in the 1980s, Bashar Assad's father had seen suicide bombing as a weapon he could use to force the Americans out of the Middle East. But over the next 30 years, it had shifted and mutated into something that had now ended up doing the very opposite, tearing the Arab world apart. Hafez al-Assad's dream of a powerful and united Arab world was now destroyed. In Iraq, extremist Sunni groups had used suicide bombing as a way to start a sectarian war. Now groups like ISIS brought the same techniques into Syria not just to attack Assad's son, but his fellow Shiites. And like his father, Bashar Assad retaliated with a vengeful fury, and the country fell apart. Faced by the war, Western politicians were bewildered. They insisted Bashar Assad was evil. But then it turned out that his enemies were more evil and more horrific than him. So Britain, America, and France decided to bomb the terrorist threat, the effect of which was to help keep Assad in power. Then it became more confusing. Suddenly, the Russians intervened. President Putin sent hundreds of planes and combat troops to support Assad. But no one knew what their underlying aim was. They seem to be using a strategy that Surkov has developed in the Ukraine. He dubbed it non-linear warfare. It was a new kind of war, where you never knew what the enemy was really doing. The underlying aim, Surkov said, was not to win the war, but to use the conflict to create a constant state of destabilized perception. In March 2016, the Russians suddenly announced with great fanfare that they were leaving Syria. But in reality, they were never leaving. And the West still had no idea what they were doing or what their goals were. And within Syria, there was a new Islamist ideologist who was going to exploit the growing uncertainties in Europe and America. His name was Abu Musab al-Suri. Al-Suri had originally worked with bin Laden in Afghanistan, but he had turned against him. Al-Suri gave lectures that had a powerful effect on the Islamist movement. He argued that bin Laden had been wrong to attack the West head-on, because it created a massive military response that had almost destroyed Islamism. Instead, al-Suri said, independent groups or individuals should stage random small-scale attacks on civilians in Europe and America. The aim was to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and undermine the already failing authority of Western politicians. The effect of the attacks shocked Europe and America, and gave powerful force to the new politics of uncertainty and anxiety. This was now the worldview seen by media corporations, politicians, and activist groups. But it wasn't just taking over politics. It had taken control of the very thing that politics is derived from. Over the last decade, while the world was distracted by growing political confusion and dishonest reporting by mainstream media, corporations had also changed dramatically. Graduates from top universities were now in charge of HR departments and marketing firms, changing the culture within corporate America. But it was from these colleges that culture began to be dismantled and dissected. Programs in social sciences began to overtake the other sciences. And soon the phenomenon known as social justice broke through into the rest of the society, deconstructing culture, history, and language. The very same ideology that had silenced the Occupy movement, modern intersectionality, social justice, and woke ideologies began to reach the point of changing the very culture of America. But this was something more. It was the birth of a new religion.